Did you ever feel the urge to take your car out for a nighttime drive, just for the sake of it? I used to love doing that, as it felt therapeutic and calming to me, particularly when I had nowhere specific to go. However, things have changed now. I'm 18 years old, and it hasn't been long since I graduated. A few weeks before my graduation, I attended a party thrown by one of my friends. I left the party around 10 p.m., and since I live 30 miles away from town, with around 20 miles of dirt roads, I had a long drive ahead of me. As I turned onto one of those roads, I was in a good mood. The radio was playing softly, and with the window down, the breeze felt refreshing. While driving at a moderate speed of around 45 miles per hour, I saw some movement up ahead. It could have been a coyote or an antelope. Suddenly, it darted across the road in front of me, and I had to swerve to avoid it. I used to drive a 2002 Jeep Wrangler, which my dad had given me as an early graduation gift. We had fixed it up together, and with its 4-inch lift kit, it was even more top-heavy than most Wranglers. While trying to avoid the animal, I swerved too hard and ended up rolling into a ditch. My forehead hit the windshield, and I lost consciousness. When I woke up, I was upside down, bleeding from a deep gash on my forehead. I couldn't recall what had happened, but I was abruptly jolted awake by something sniffing and snuffling around the Jeep, emitting a foul, putrid odor. The stench was so overwhelming that I gagged. In an instant, my memory came rushing back. I remembered the eerie figure that had been walking on the road in front of me. It was naked, thin, and pale, with long dangling arms, a tall and thin head, and small, glowing eyes that definitely weren't human. After the accident, I searched for my knife, which I had purchased with birthday money and kept in the Jeep for emergencies. The middle console had spilled open during the crash, and the overturned Jeep made it difficult to find anything. Eventually, I located the knife on the roof and used it to cut my seatbelt. As I fell to the ground, I experienced excruciating pain in my left arm and realized that I couldn't move it. Despite the discomfort, I forced myself to sit up and noticed that the snuffling outside had grown more frantic. It seemed that the creature had heard me. Suddenly, I saw 2 feet outside the driver's side window, which were just as thin and elongated as the rest of the creature. The feet had 4 toes and were caked with dried blood. As the scratching on the door grew more persistent, I became desperate and stabbed the creature's foot with my knife. It let out a piercing shriek and ran away into the darkness. I crawled out of the window, but stood up too quickly and blacked out. The next day, I woke up in the hospital. My dad had grown worried when I didn't return home, and he found me passed out next to the overturned Jeep. I had suffered head trauma and lost a lot of blood. Afraid of being ridiculed or dismissed as insane, I lied to everyone and said that I had fallen asleep at the wheel. However, I couldn't explain the deep scratches on the driver's side door of the Jeep, which appeared to have been made by a human. Over the next several months, peculiar rumors circulated throughout town. Ranchers claimed to have discovered dead cattle with their insides scattered about, while locals at cafes swapped tales of seeing peculiar lights, hearing eerie sounds, and glimpsing strange eyes in the darkness. Eventually, it appeared that everyone had caught a glimpse of the mysterious thin man of Tatum, New Mexico. However, the talk and sightings of the creature abruptly ceased after a few months. The creature, along with the anomalous lights, vanished without a trace. After experiencing these events, I've lost my desire to go for nighttime drives. I struggle to fall asleep at night, but I don't want to complain about having false insomnia. It's simply difficult for me to drift off. Some suggest that my issue stems from anxiety, while others recommend that I take pills. However, I have never sought medical advice for it. Instead, I opt to hop into my truck and drive around for an hour at night to unwind and relax. This method may be costly, but it helps me sleep well throughout the night without any problems. I reside in Lubbock, Texas. For those familiar with the area, You are aware that it takes several miles in either direction before reaching another town once you leave Lubbock. The highways that exit Lubbock traverse miles of flat and barren land before arriving at another town. And even then, the towns are so minuscule that you could toss a stone across them, and it would be out before it hits the ground. If you take Highway 84, you'll find that it's a long drive from Lubbock to Littlefield, the closest large town to the city. However, when alone, it's a delightful drive to take. It's serene, tranquil, and dark. The kind of drive that almost makes you fall asleep at the wheel. It was a typical frigid night in late January when this incident occurred. Recently, I had resumed my classes at Texas Tech, and the stress was getting to me. When I couldn't sleep around midnight, I resorted to my usual routine of grabbing my keys, donning a coat, taking a small cup of warm coffee, and driving around. That night, I opted to take Highway 84 since I hadn't driven on it since returning from winter break. After passing Shallowater, I embarked on the long expanse of open road between Shallowater and Anton. While traversing the road, I heard a tapping sound on my passenger window. At first, I presumed it was a rock and disregarded it. However, the tapping continued, 3 distinct taps on my passenger window, as if someone was attempting to grab my attention. I looked out the window, but to this day, I wish I hadn't. As I gazed back at the window, I was confronted by a man with dark black irises. His complexion was so pallid that it seemed almost gray. He was positioned directly in the center of the window and was grinning widely, displaying all of his teeth. They were immaculate, pearly white, and flawlessly arranged. His hair was jet black and neatly trimmed, reminiscent of a style from the 1950s. That smile, however, was the most malevolent thing I had ever witnessed. It was permanently etched into my memory. My truck jolted and swerved slightly into the opposite lane as I recoiled from the window in shock. I had looked away, hoping that what I saw was a figment of my imagination. When I glanced back, he was still there, smiling at me as if he had been anticipating my arrival. He lifted his hand and began waving at me, but I turned my gaze ahead, not daring to look back. My truck veered to the left lane and then swerved back to the right, but I didn't turn my head to check if he had vanished. I was too terrified to look. I kept reminding myself to keep my focus on the road and search for a spot to turn around. As I was driving, I caught a glimpse of something moving in my peripheral vision. When I looked over, I saw a naked man running on all fours. Shocked, I checked my speedometer and saw that I was going 75 miles per hour. I turned back to the man and saw that he was still there, smiling at me. Panicked, I stepped on the gas and sped away, but then I heard him jump into the back of my truck. Looking in the rearview mirror, I saw him staring back at me, still smiling. I was on the verge of tears and just wanted him to disappear. I quickly found a place to turn around, slammed on the brakes, and checked the mirror, but he had not moved an inch. Without even checking to make the turn, I hit the gas and sped away, ignoring the speed limit as I felt it was an emergency. When I arrived back in Lubbock, I knew he was no longer in my truck because I did not see or hear him. But as I turned onto my street, there he was, standing on my front porch and waving at me. My friend shared a disturbing story with me about a young woman from Sweden who was staying with her as a couch surfer. Although I don't recall the girl's name, I can't forget the chilling tale she recounted. Let's refer to her as Jane. One evening, Jane was driving to her mother's house, located in a remote, densely forested area far from the city. The road was unlit, and only a few houses were scattered along it, set back from the forest, and accessed by long, winding driveways. As Jane drove, she spotted a small bundle lying by the side of the road ahead. As her car passed the object, she was horrified to realize that it appeared to be a baby wrapped in a blanket. Slamming on the brakes, she backed up and leaped out of the car, hurrying over to the bundle, convinced that someone had abandoned a baby there. To her immense relief, upon closer inspection, she saw that it was just a toy baby. However, as she bent down to pick up the toy, Jane noticed headlights approaching from the direction she had been driving. Suddenly aware of the potential danger of standing alone on an unlit road at night, she quickly retrieved the toy and dashed back to her car. Breathing heavily, she started the engine and drove off, shaken by the unnerving experience. As Jane drove, a car behind her suddenly accelerated, closing in dangerously close to her rear bumper while honking its horn incessantly. Panicked, Jane sped up, continuously glancing in her rearview mirror, unable to discern who was driving the other car. Despite her fear, she pressed on, eventually arriving at her mother's house, situated deep within the forest and accessed via a 2-kilometer-long driveway. As Jane turned onto the driveway, the other car followed closely behind her, intensifying her terror. She recalled the unsettling incident with the toy baby and the eeriness of the evening. Acting quickly, Jane dialed her mother's number, informing her that she was being followed and instructing her to call the police. She estimated that she would arrive at her destination in approximately 5 minutes. Both cars were speeding recklessly down the dark and unlit road, their headlights providing the only illumination. Jane could see nothing beyond the narrow beams of light, consumed by anxiety as the other car continued to tailgate her dangerously close. As Jane approached her mother's house, she spotted it in the distance, the pursuing car still tailing her closely and honking its horn so loudly that her ears rang. As she pulled up to the front of the house, Jane hastily exited her car and was met by her mother, who was standing outside holding a kitchen knife. Jane ran towards her as fast as she could. Meanwhile, the car that had been following Jane screeched to a stop, and its doors flew open, revealing an elderly couple who were shouting and pointing towards Jane's car. "Someone got into your car," they screamed. It dawned on Jane what had happened. Someone had taken advantage of her act of kindness and left the toy baby on the road to lure her out of her car while an accomplice sneaked in. The man who had entered her car quickly jumped out of the back seat and fled into the forest. Everyone was stunned as they realized the gravity of the situation. Jane couldn't shake the feeling that this was not the first time the criminals had attempted this scheme. She urged everyone to be cautious and reminded them to always lock their car doors when leaving the vehicle. Thank you for watching today's video. If you enjoyed it, please consider liking and sharing it to support me. The best is yet to come.